Shen Jinfeng moved in and aimed for a vital strike, but missed and cursed under his breath. He felt the burn from his earlier lightning thrust and the strain in his limbs. The blue demon slid aside with effortless motion and stood unbroken beneath the mask. It lashed a long, thin appendage that sliced the air and struck toward Shen across the roof. Shen stumbled back to regain footing and barely avoided the full blow. The demon taunted him aloud, challenging a caster's chance to land melee hits. Shen's face split into a grin that mixed fury and amusement. He laughed out loud and tightened his stance while both prepared for the next violent exchange. Smoke still clung to the rooftop as Shen Jinfeng staggered from a fresh wound. He gasped and pressed his hand to his chest while a hot pain spread. A game-style description box popped into view naming a new skill and its effects. The demon wore a false mask and moved with calm precision as it prepared the attack. Purple sigils and filaments coalesced around the demon and wrapped toward Shen's torso. The skill consumed mana and promised escalating damage over time as the sigils burned. A long, thin tendril lashed out and slammed through the roof toward the street below. Concrete shattered and a dark spray marked the impact far from the rooftop's edge. The demon watched as the connection held steady and Shen fought for his footing. Smoke still clung to the rooftop as Shen Jinfeng pressed at his wound and planned to retreat. He muttered that the enemy was an elite monster and that he needed cover. Far below, a blue figure moved among trees. The blue troll raised its heavy staff and set its stance. Its carved mask stared as it wound up for an overhead strike. The staff hit the ground and a ring of dark sigils burst outward. A purple toad materialized inside the ring amid swirling shadows and black droplets. The toad blinked and displayed floating question marks above its head. Shen winced at the new threat and staggered toward a safer angle. The blue troll advanced, poised to exploit any opening while the summoning left the toad confused. Smoke still clung to the rooftop while Shen Jinfeng pressed at his wound. He weighed retreat but knew the enemy was elite and needed cover. Far below, the blue troll raised its heavy staff and completed the summoning. A purple toad blinked, confused within a ring of dark sigils on the ground. The troll's droplet fell, became a hovering shadow fiend, and pulsed with malice. Its red eyes fixed on a masked fighter who stood too close to the circle. Dark strands of energy lashed out and wrapped the fighter in whispering black filaments. Panels on the fighter's chest flared as corruption fed into its form and armor. Shen peered from cover, voice low, refusing to abandon allies while threats multiplied. He braced and moved to engage again, hoping to stem the enemy's advance. Energy erupted from the ruined summoning circle and slammed into the masked fighter's armor. Dark filaments coalesced and wrapped the fighter, bending metal and warping his stance. Shen Jinfeng watched from cover while the filaments fed a pulsing sigil on the chest. The armor split outward and shadow stitched into a hulking avatar around the man. Red light flared from new eyes and a terrible roar shivered across the rooftop. Shen forced himself up, lining his shoulders and counting beats before he moved. He dashed toward the avatar as it turned and unleashed a serrated energy blast. The blast tore concrete and sent dust streaming past the stairwell opening. A thin column of white light then pierced the gloom and held a hovering figure above the rooftop. The white column had held a hovering figure above the rooftop. Impact struck the concrete in quick succession as something slammed down nearby. Dust and debris sprayed upward from each new strike. Two shadowed forms emerged from the smoke and laughed at the chaos. One form pulsed with purple filaments, while the other flexed a hulking blue frame. The hulking figure bared its throat as sigils flared across its chest. The masked fighter steadied himself, drawing a faint glowing sigil into his palm. Shen Jinfeng braced and timed his move, calling the moment aloud. Warning overlays and red alerts splashed the scene as targeting arrays locked. Filaments spiraled and stitched together, and a single red eye burned into being. The rooftop shuddered under the arrival of a stitched shadow avatar. The stitched avatar finished assembling above the rooftop, and a single red eye opened. It spun into a tight spiral of filaments and dove at a green-clad figure on the concrete. The impact slammed the figure into the roof and sent shards and dust into the air. Blue caption boxes annotated the avatar's structure and its rapid recovery protocols. The masked fighter kept his position while faint sigils around him dimmed and held. From the avatar's underside, a smaller shadow separated and hovered directly behind Shen Jinfeng. The shadow showed two burning red eyes and a ragged winged outline. Shen turned and stared, clearly puzzled by the apparition's attachment. He braced for a follow-up strike as the rooftop trembled and danger remained unresolved. The stitched avatar had shed a darker shadow that hovered behind Shen Jinfeng. A lance of blue lightning drove past Shen and struck the roof with shattering force. Shen shouted to warn his allies as debris rained and the concrete split. The detached shadow bared its burning red eyes and made a mocking snarl. Energy coursed along a narrow channel and hammered the concrete courtyard below. Amid the fallout, a man in white stepped forward and laughed aloud. His laughter echoed as crimson sigils bloomed around his eyes without warning. A sudden burst of red power detonated against him and sent him stumbling. He froze with shock and muttered that a monster's soul showed familiarity. The rooftop remained unstable, and every combatant braced for the next strike. Shen Jinfeng felt the stitched avatar's darker shadow stalk behind him across the rooftop. A lance of blue lightning had sliced past and shattered concrete near his feet. He shouted warnings as debris rained, and the courtyard buckled under shifting force. A detached shadow bared burning red eyes and snarled at the gathered combatants. One man in white moved forward and laughed as he drew a blade. Crimson sigils flared briefly around his eyes, then a red burst sent him stumbling. He claimed familiarity with a monster's soul just before the roof opened. Another attacker leapt from the parapet and struck with a sweeping blade. The impact tore the slab free and drove a column of rubble upward. Purple energy spilled from the crater and fused with the wound in the sky. Every fighter braced as the rooftop heaved and the next strike approached. Shen Jinfeng realized the detection alarm had already sounded. Purple sigils crawled across his skin and a dark aura leaked from his wounds. He lunged for the parapet and tried to throw himself clear as the rooftop fractured beneath him. Debris and concrete shards tore past his face and slashed his shoulder. He kept repeating that he had to escape quickly. A jagged slab ripped free and threw him down into a widening crater. Black-purple energy coalesced around the wound and pinned his arms to jagged concrete. He coughed blood and clawed at the rim, thinking he could not fall here. The pull from the sky's rent dragged at his chest and blurred his vision. Shadow spikes erupted from the impact and scattered stone into the air. Through dust and raining rubble, a single hand reached up, fingers scraping for purchase. Shen Jinfeng had felt detectors scream and purple sigils crawl across his skin. The rooftop split and jagged concrete ripped into his arms and chest. A vast shadow figure loomed, its dark aura tearing the night. Nearby, a bloody man begged for mercy and claimed he had surrendered. Shen forced himself upright despite the wound and the spinning rubble. Blue energy coiled around his feet as the terrace winds howled. System messages scrolled past confirming several saved skills and a class change. A translucent mirror interface appeared and showed his new status card. He realized the mirror had accepted the class change before he had. The card labeled him LV3 and listed Strength 3, Endurance 3, and Intelligence 3. It also displayed 30 HP and 30 mana, anchoring reality to numbers. The rooftop lay quiet under a slivered moon as Shen Jinfeng descended toward a service access. He watched translucent system text confirm saved skills and a new LV3 status card before he tapped a metal panel. The hatch clanged and a stairwell shaft yawed open, spilling a raw purple light into the corridor. Dark tendrils snaked outward and struck the concrete with sizzling force. One tendril lashed at Shen's ankle, and a cold pull hauled him toward the rift. He braced and staggered as violet electricity crawled along the opening and a pale shape pressed through. The presence exhaled a hollow sound and fixed its glowing eyes on him while wind roared across the terrace. After the rooftop rift bled violet light, the sequence cut to a frozen ridge. A large white beast padded through heavy drifts and nosed at a fallen branch in search of food. Snow stung its whiskers, and it cocked its head in puzzled silence. A dark fissure opened along a nearby trunk, and purple smoke pooled against the bark. The smoke condensed into a hovering shadow that exposed a single burning red eye and a coiling mass of inky limbs. It struck the tree and splintered wood into flakes and shards that scattered across the snow. The beast flinched and reared up on powerful hind legs. Snow cascaded from its flanks as it bared teeth and fixed its own eyes to crimson. It roared, dropped to all fours, and thundered toward the hovering intruder. The ridge went still as the two figures closed. Shadow Fiend crouched on the snow and counted down, then readied itself. The snow beast planted its paw and smashed through drifts. Momentum carried the beast forward, and it lost balance on the hard pack. Shadow Fiend struck during the stumble, claws and dark force tearing through white fur. Snow exploded outward, and red flecks stained the field. The attacker tore free through the spray and surged away, leaving a ragged wound. Silence fell over the cratered snow. Shadow Fiend remained perched and spoke a short line as system boxes appeared over the scene. Text and status overlays declared the wound and logged the encounter while the ridge settled under drifting flakes. The ridge stayed quiet while Shadow Fiend slowly circled the cratered snow. It flexed dark claws and spoke a short line that summoned faint glyph light. The snow beast rose from a spill of powder and met the strike with a howl. Shadow Fiend drove a sigil blade into white fur and rippled dark energy through the wound. Snow erupted around them, and crimson flecks traced arcs across the wind. The beast staggered, lunged, and smashed through packed drifts before it lost balance on hard ice. Shadow Fiend timed a retreat, then vaulted and struck a blue rune into the shoulder. The creature fell into a shallow pit, gasping as frost gathered on torn flesh. System readouts and floating status boxes appeared and logged damage and encounter markers. Shadow Fiend remained perched above the crater and watched the ridge as flakes drifted down. Silence settled over the field while the wound bled and light from runes pulsed faintly. A floating status box blinked and declared the snow beast's HP was low. An unseen hand reached in and pressed a small device on the HUD. Circling runes sprang up and coiled around the beast's body. A blue sigil flared, and a rune blade struck the beast's shoulder. Frost raced outward, and fur froze into crystalline blades along torn flesh. The creature howled and expelled a twisting violet smoke from its wound. The smoke condensed into a dark backlash that slammed into Shadow Fiend. The impact tore through shadowed flesh and pulsed across active runes. Shadow Fiend staggered, slid on ice, and hit the ground hard. Status overlays flickered with instability warnings before the field quieted. Snow drifted down while runes flickered and shallow blood steamed on ice. The rune blade had cut deep, and the frozen field had erupted around the fallen snow beast and the staggered Shadow Fiend. Frost spread and blood steamed as status readouts blinked instability alerts. A critical warning panel flashed across the HUD while circling runes sputtered. The shadow fiend lay sliding on ice, its sigil strobing faintly. Snow drifted, and the field quieted into brittle echoes. From the debris, a dark silhouette stirred, and a single massive eye opened to scan the ruin. The purple-masked presence blinked its red glyph and then spoke, surprised at a small moving shape. The lone observation named a rat and shifted the scene's focus, leaving runes, wounds, and warning overlays suspended in cold silence. The field remained cold and brittle after the rune blade struck, the shadow fiend sliding across ice while a rat drew a lone observer's focus. In a nearby cave, Luo Zhen admitted he had been following the fighter to loot the corpse. He smiled and judged the other foolish for leaving at low HP, noting the other plane's richer spoils. He relished the chance and then revealed a learned ability labeled Blame Transfer, with an on-screen description of mana cost and aggro mechanics. Red tendrils sprang from his hands and drove into the snow beast's wound. The beast staggered as crimson sigils spread and aggro indicators shifted away. Luo Zhen watched calm while the cave filled with tearing flesh and dripping blood, his intent made plain by the stolen advantage. The aftermath of the rune blade held its brittle silence before a roaring cyan column split the sky. Light struck the frozen ground, and glass and ice exploded outward. Debris spun while a dark purple form was hurled through the air, trailing shadow and limp limbs. The blow carved a new crater where frost met stone and widened the violent scene. Luo Zhen's earlier blame transfer had already left the snow beast staggered, and the cave reeking of blood and tearing flesh. Red tendrils had shifted aggro markers, and the fresh strike erased footholds and scattered sigils across the ice. Observers ducked as the assault closed another chapter of chaos, leaving shattered ice and a single prone silhouette in its wake. The aftermath held brittle silence before a roaring cyan column cleaved the sky overhead. Light struck frozen ground and glass, and ice exploded into spinning shards and debris. A dark purple form trailed shadow and limp limbs as the blast hurled it skyward. The impact carved a new crater where frost met stone and widened the violent scene. Earlier blame transfer had left the snow beast staggered and the cave reeking of gore. Red tendrils had shifted aggro markers and scattered sigils across the broken ice. Observers ducked as the assault closed another chapter of chaos, leaving a single prone silhouette. The purple form landed and condensed into a hovering shadow with bright red eyes. Luo Zhen's face tightened behind glasses as he watched the creature orient and advance directly. He muttered that he had expected nothing, and then realized the monster knew his position. The scene ended with ice shards still falling, and the shadow drawing inexorably nearer to him. The hovering shadow had already oriented toward Luo Zhen when its single red eye flared. A caption declared CLARVOINTI, and the darkness rippled into a corporeal form. Veins of light spidered across the pupil as the monster's limbs knit together. It drew in and pushed out air, then launched itself with a blast of cyan energy. Ice and shattered glass slashed past as the creature accelerated toward ground level. Luo Zhen's glasses reflected the eye's glare, and his expression tightened. He recognized the gaze and understood his cover had failed. He uttered a terse curse and prepared for impact. The panels ended with the shadow fiend mid-lunge and Luo Zhen's wide, sweating eye filling the frame. The shadow fiend had coalesced and flared its single red eye before it struck. Veins of cyan energy snapped into a blade that tore through ice and glass. The blast gouged the cliff face and hurled rubble in a widening spray. The creature rode the shockwave and accelerated downward along a spiraling path. Chunks of rock and shards of ice skimmed past as it descended toward the floor. Luo Zhen's glasses caught the glare and his jaw tightened. He spat a terse curse and braced. The impact carried the fiend past his position and flung it out over the ravine. Luo Zhen dropped to a crouch in the settling dust and spoke calmly. He taunted the attacker, saying the direct charge had played into his trap. The sequence closed with the Shadow Fiend still falling and Luo Zhen watching, composed and ready. The attacker cried out mass blame transfer and channeled crimson rings of force. Energy coalesced around a lone figure and burst outward in circular arcs. Dozens of red eyes appeared in the dark and tracked the arcs as monsters stirred. Snow beasts collapsed their forms and slid across the ground toward a reflective surface. Captured text boxes noted the beasts aggregated onto the mirror repeatedly. The mirror drew the creatures and held them fused against its face. The Shadow Fiend scraped the edge of the effect and spun amid falling debris. Luo Zhen stood nearby and watched the transfer with tight control. He did not move to free the trapped beasts. The scene closed with the mirror crowded by reflected monsters and the attacker maintaining the red aura. The attacker had already funneled crimson rings that burst outward and drew dozens of red eyes toward a mirror. The mirror held reflected beasts pressed against its face, while the Shadow Fiend scraped the edge of the effect. Luo Zhen watched the transfer with tight control and made no move to free the trapped creatures. He then stepped forward and taunted the defender about handling a mob and a boss at once. The Shadow Fiend's red eye flashed as a horned snow beast reared and launched a roar. Luo Zhen's expression hardened, and he shouted a single command. A golden flash erupted beneath the beast, and the caption declared vanish. The boss collapsed into light, and the surrounding monsters scattered, marked by confusion. Only one small figure remained far below on the ice, isolated and alone. The vanished boss left a vacuum that snapped toward Luo Zhen like a drawn thread. A system caption declared the snow monster's aggro transferred to Luo Zhen, and a red reticle flared. The snow beast's hulking silhouette filled the panel behind him, eyes glowing like hot coals. Luo Zhen staggered as the weight of the transfer settled over his shoulders. His mouth opened and he shouted in disbelief, words cut off by shock. Sweat beaded along his temples as his breathing quickened and his hands trembled. He realized the defender's gambit had rebounded against him and left him exposed. An inner thought accused the unseen opponent of turning the tables on him. He stood facing the looming beast with no reinforcements and no plan. The roof erupted as a defender shouted and unleashed blazing projectiles to drive attackers back. Orbs struck and detonated, tearing cracked stone and flinging blue sigils into the air. The blasts carved fractures that disrupted the snow beast's looming silhouette behind the dust. A red-eyed shadow observed from cover and delivered a smug taunt about the quest rules. It claimed the mishap had worked in its favor and that it had avoided first damage. Luo Zhen remembered the transferred aggro and the sudden weight that settled across his shoulders. No reinforcements answered his need. The explosions left a lone silhouette standing amid rising dust and debris. Luo Zhen slammed onto the cracked ground moments later, blood leaking and breath ragged as panic replaced any plan. The roof still stank of smoke and drifting sigils as the scene sharpened. A pale snow beast lay exposed beneath cracked stone and scattered fur. A dark figure materialized above its gaping ocular cavity and struck with brutal focus. The Shadow Fiend plunged a tendril or blade into the creature's eyeball and drove it home. Black and purple ichor spouted as the wound opened and dispersed across the white fur. The eyeball quivered, then fissured under the assault, and a blue pupil stared dumbly. Dark blood rained down in heavy arcing streams across splintered stone and fur. The shadow's red eyes blazed as it held position above the wound, unbothered by the recoil. Nearby dust still curled, where prior explosions had rocked the roof's surface. The gathered chaos left a single clear fact: the snow beast had been critically struck at its eye. Smoke and lingering sigils hung over the roof as the scene sharpened. Cyan beams erupted from a central point, and sliced outward in precise spokes. A black caption read "Vanish" as the light severed air and masonry. A broad cyan blade swept low and ripped fir and stone apart. The shadow fiend held at the blast's eye, then folded into a curling cloud of dust and smoke. The blade's wake sheared across the deck and slammed the snow beast onto the tiles. The creature landed face first with its eye ruptured and black ichor spreading over white fur. Splinters and residue drifted where the attack had passed. A small purple-cloaked figure lay near the fallen head, still and indistinct. Only settling dust and the steady drip of dark blood marked the aftermath. The roof fell silent. Smoke and black sigils still clung to the rooftop when system text began to appear. Blue panels listed skill saves and class upgrades for Luo Chen and Mirror Image. A new assassin class and stamina conversion were applied across all entries. The assassin's blade had upgraded into a bloodletting bayonet with life drain properties. The blade appeared stained dark red and oozing fresh fluid over its edge. A mirror card fell into shadow and logged out of the mirror as the master assassin. Game text reported massive experience gained and plug-in card acquisition for the active profile. Shen Jinfeng reached out and lifted the glowing mirror card from drifting smoke. He held it palm up while black residue traced back across the torn tiles below. Smoke and black sigils still clung to the rooftop when system panels listed the mirror plugin's features. Shen Jinfeng stood with his back to the panels while the plugin text scrolled across the air. The system described mirror credit abilities, pre-claiming rewards, follower limits, and lethal level penalties for failure. A special reward notification flashed, and he registered the skill's risk and value. His eyes widened as an exit unlocked prompt appeared near a jagged tear in the floor. The tear opened into a massive purple mirror framed by cracked tiles and dark light. He remembered lifting the drifting mirror card from smoke moments earlier and felt its pull. The final status panel confirmed Shen Jinfeng as LV5 and the mirror as Master Assassin with follower slots logged. Shen Jinfeng stepped to the mirror's rim and hesitated as the portal thrummed beneath his foot. He narrowed his eyes and listened when a distant noise split the night and drew his attention away from the system panels. The sound led him to trace a drifting smoke plume across the skyline toward the city. He realized the plume marked the shelter's direction and fixed his stance toward it. From the rooftop, he watched a broad stadium below where black smoke curled from impact sites and small figures scattered near parked cars. Embers dotted the ground and ash fell from the air. He felt the mirror's pull and the weight of his master assassin status, then chose movement toward the tier and the path to the crowd below. Shen Jinfeng moved toward the tier and observed the crowd and smoke below. On an adjacent rooftop, a defensive barrier split from a single heavy strike. Two men stared as sparks raced along the crack and smoke spilled outward. They identified the attacker as a merchant who had been wandering nearby minutes earlier. The figure pulsed with a red aura, and the system flagged his level as unknown. One man called to Zhao Jia for a read, while tension tightened across the roof. Zhao Jia brought up a quick scan and tried to read the attacker status. Another voice dismissed the detail and moved instead to intercept without waiting. A green-haired man launched himself from the rail and dove toward the merchant. Shen felt the scene escalate and braced to push toward the crowd below. Shen Jinfeng moved toward the tier and watched smoke and the crowd below. On the adjacent rooftop, a defensive barrier had split from a single heavy strike. Two men stared as sparks raced along the crack and smoke spilled outward. A gnome merchant stood below and pulsed with a red aura as the system flagged his level unknown. One voice asked Zhao Jia to read the attacker while tension tightened across the roof. Zhao Jia initiated a quick scan and tried to identify the merchant's status. Another man dismissed the call and moved to intercept without waiting for orders. The green-haired leaper launched himself from the rail and dove toward the merchant. Shen braced as the scene escalated and prepared to push toward the crowd below. Shen Jinfeng had moved toward the tier and watched Smoke and the crowd below. The green-haired leaper launched himself from the rail and delivered a brutal overhead slash with blue energy trailing his blade. Wind sheared outward as the strike released a curved shockwave across the courtyard and ripped through nearby tree canopies. Sparks and embers scattered where the wave struck ground and building surfaces. Fragments of a defensive barrier still smoked from an earlier heavy blow. On the adjacent rooftop, two men stiffened beneath falling debris and stared, sweat tracking their faces. Zhao Jia's scan results and system pings echoed as responders tightened ranks. Shen braced and prepared to push toward the crowd below while the scene escalated. Shen Jinfeng had edged toward the tier while smoke rose and the crowd writhed below. The green-haired leaper launched from the rail and delivered a brutal overhead slash that trailed blue energy across the courtyard. Wind sheared outward and carved a curved shockwave through trees and tile as sparks and embers scattered. A fragmented defensive barrier still smoked from an earlier heavy blow. Two men on the adjacent rooftop froze beneath falling debris, sweat tracking their faces. Zhao Jia's scans and system pings chimed as responders tightened ranks. On the upper walkway, a bearded figure raised a curved blade and struck, sending crystal and ice shards scattering. A blue impact struck back and briefly revealed a jagged maw. A yellow arc answered the bite and spun air into a violent whirl. Shen braced and prepared to push toward the crowd as the fight spiraled downward. Shen Jinfeng had edged toward the tier while smoke rose and responders tightened ranks. Below, Zhao Jia staggered after one brutal strike that threatened to end his fight. An allied caster crouched and triggered an electrolysis spell, cracking blue energy between their hands. The caster's face went white as the attacker closed distance with a single punch. The incantation was only half formed when the strike ruptured their concentration and failed. The attacker answered with a sudden slash of electric-charged blades that sang through air. The slash carved a violent whirl that ripped debris and knocked a cloaked figure off balance. Sparks scattered across the rooftop and fighters braced as momentum spilled toward the crowd. Shen readied himself to push forward, but the interruption slowed his advance. Shen Jinfeng had edged toward the tier, while smoke rose and responders tightened ranks below. On the rooftop, two watchers saw combatants fall in a single strike and voiced alarm, asking if the barrier could withstand more. A man labeled LV5 Shen Yuan jeered about a missing heavy hitter and questioned their luck. The scene shifted as an ornate hammer was raised above the deck. An unknown assailant swung the weapon in a wide arc. The hammer crashed into the rooftop with brutal force, and a radial shockwave ripped concrete and dust outward. Debris sprayed toward the railing and fighters staggered back. The impact stalled every advance and left the rooftop scarred, the watchers clinging to the edge as unanswered threats gathered in the ruined dust. Shen Jinfeng edged toward the tier as smoke boiled and responders tightened ranks below. Two rooftop watchers saw combatants fall in a single strike and voiced alarm about the barrier. Shen Yuan taunted them from the railing and questioned their luck. An ornate hammer rose and swung in a wide arc from an unknown wielder. The hammer slammed into the deck with brutal force and sent a radial shockwave outward. Concrete and dust tore outward and debris slammed fighters back toward the railing, stalling every advance. The barrier shuddered under the blast, then tore open above the deck. A figure crashed through the breach, and a watcher shouted that the barrier was like paper. Panic followed as another voice cried that they were doomed, and the rooftop held only ruin. Smoke and dust swelled as responders tightened ranks below the roof. Watchers saw combatants fall in a single strike and voiced alarm about the failing barrier. Shen Yuan taunted the rooftop from the railing and questioned their luck. An ornate hammer rose in a wide arc and slammed into the deck. The impact sent a radial shockwave through concrete and dust. Debris hurled fighters back toward the railing and stalled every advance. The barrier shuddered and then ripped open above the deck. A figure crashed through the breach and landed hard amid the ruin. He rose into view and planted his feet. He announced that no one would get through while he stood guard. The ornate hammer came down and shattered the rooftop into a storm of concrete and dust. The radial blast hurled fragments outward and split the deck underfoot. A bald man in a red shirt braced and aimed a double-barrel weapon, but was smashed under flying rubble as the slab collapsed. A dark-cloaked attacker spun through the ruin among whirling shards and used the explosion to gain momentum. When dust thinned, the attacker pushed off the air and launched toward the fallen gunman. The gunman looked up, stunned, as an impact crater opened at his feet. He tightened his grip on the weapon while the attacker closed the distance in a single sweeping motion. Responders below held position and watched the two combatants face each other at the torn barrier. The ornate hammer had fallen and shattered the rooftop into a storm of concrete. The radial blast hurled fragments and split the deck beneath their feet. A bald man in a red shirt braced and aimed a double-barrel weapon. The slab collapsed under flying rubble. A dark-cloaked attacker used the explosion to spin through the ruin and gain momentum. When dust thinned, the attacker pushed off the air and launched toward the fallen gunman. The gunman looked up, stunned, as an impact crater opened at his feet. Responders below held position and watched the two combatants face each other at the torn barrier. On the nearby parapet, Xian set a scoped rifle and adjusted her aim. She said her enchantments were low-level, so damage would be limited. Her companion noted Zhang Yi's presence and strength. Another voice declared Zhang Yi one of the top two powerhouses keeping the shelter standing. The rooftop lay broken after the hammer's blast shredded concrete and split the deck. Dust boiled as a cloaked attacker used the rupture to spin through the ruin. The attacker pushed off the air and launched toward a bald gunman bracing with a double-barrel weapon. Observers on the parapet quietly traded remarks about strength and possible reinforcements. Xian set her scoped rifle and warned that her enchantments were low-level. Her companion noted Zhang Yi's presence and insisted he could handle the threat. The attacker slammed into the gunman and opened a crater at his feet. The gunman stared stunned and admitted he could not keep holding back. He feared either himself or the barrier behind him would suddenly fail. Zhang Yi then erupted with a furious red aura that shook the rooftop. The roar boosted his attacks with fire and granted brief immunity to fear. The rooftop fight had shredded concrete and boiled dust across the deck. A cloaked attacker had slammed into the bald gunman and opened a smoking crater. Observers on the parapet traded terse warnings about reinforcements and failing barriers. Xian set her scoped rifle and warned her enchantments were low-level. Zhang Yi had erupted in a furious red aura that steadied his stance. The view then tightened on a bald, masked figure whose eyes flared bright red. His fist glowed with a roiling crimson power and threw off hot embers. He drew the charge back and drove the punch forward toward the parapet. The rooftop shuddered as the strike bore down and sent sparks outward. Everyone braced for the collision as smoke and light filled the air. The rooftop had already been torn by dust and shattered concrete from earlier impacts. The unnamed gunman then gathered a crimson charge in his fist. He drew the power back and drove a devastating punch toward the parapet. The blow erupted into a red shockwave and blew fragments outward. The energy coalesced into a crimson vortex that climbed above the rooftop. Dust and embers spun in the updraft and obscured the distant skyline. Those on the parapet braced as the column folded and the light intensified. When the flare finally subsided, a column of smoke and ash fell back down. At its base, the bald man remained standing amid smoking rubble and bent metal. He panted and steadied himself, hand clenched, chest rising with each breath. Xian stepped forward from the railing and shouted that they had won. Together they scanned the ruined roof for survivors and watched the city burn. The rooftop had already been shredded by dust and shattered concrete. The unnamed gunman gathered a crimson charge. He drove it into a vortex that climbed above the parapet. When the flare subsided, he remained standing amid smoking rubble and bent metal. Green healing light rose from a dark orb nearby as small green forms tended it. The unnamed gunman watched warily while the light pulsed and plus signs floated upward. Suddenly, a figure dove from above and struck toward the bald man with blurring speed. The hit sent the unnamed gunman stumbling back and crashing through a chunk of railing. Burning fragments and sparks sprayed across the roof and fell to the street below. Xian stepped forward and shouted that they had won, then blinked at the unexpected recovery. Survivors scanned the ruin for movement as smoke and ash still rose. The rooftop lay shredded under ash and twisted concrete from the prior clash. Xian had declared victory, but watched warily as new threats surfaced. The unnamed gunman maintained a crimson charge among smoking wreckage and tended a dark healing orb nearby. A fiery ring spiraled up and slammed against the battered parapet with blinding sparks. Embers rained across the deck as metal groaned and small fires took hold. A figure collapsed through a gap in the railing and struck the lower roof under falling dust. An impact detonated into a star-shaped blast, sending shards of concrete outward. A voice shouted the command charge, and fighters surged toward danger with weapons raised. A red filament of energy cleaved through the air and ripped roofing panels free. Debris tumbled into the street as survivors braced and scanned for movement. A woman with purple hair warned a companion, her words trailing as alarms and dust swallowed sound.